Resource conflicts have become an increasingly important issue in Latin America for several reasons. The first, I would say, is the fact that this sort of turn to the left, progressive governments and the whole constitutional changes, especially in the cases of Ecuador and Bolivia, which included very radical notions of rights of nature and notions of alternative concepts of the good life and challenges to Western development, etc., created enormous expectations as to the possibility of getting away from this Western model of development and for alternatives that were based on respect for the environment, for a new conception of the relations between humans and nature, etc. And after this decade, if you look at the statistics, the official UN statistics on the composition of exports for all of South American countries, it's clear that there has been an increase in the dependency on primary exports, on exports of commodities. This has to do with the fact that there has been a huge increase in demand for commodities. This has led to an increase in prices. So in the short term, for every government, whether it's left, right, neoliberal, revolutionary, whatever you call it, in the short term, it's the easiest source of income. And so, in spite of the content of the constitutions and in spite of the political rhetoric in terms of alternatives, etc., and in spite of the fact that these governments got into power in many cases as a consequence of struggles that were questioning this model, the fact is that there has been an increase in commodity production. In the case of Venezuela, for instance, it's not really an increase, but the increase in the price has been so huge that in the total foreign trade of the country, 96% is due to oil in terms of income from foreign exchange and from foreign trade. In the case of Ecuador and Bolivia, for instance, there's a decision by the governments to accumulate in the first part of the transformation process, accumulation based on commodities in order to be able to get away from commodities. And that's the way they argue it. In the Plan del Buen Vivir, in the case of Ecuador, it's a 20-year plan. And the first part of the plan means an increase in mining, which really wasn't an important activity in the case of Ecuador, which is supposed to lead to a second stage and a third stage in which you can get away from mining. In my view, this is completely absurd. It's completely absurd because first, we don't have the time for that. I mean, the environmental crisis is such that we have to face the need for alternatives at this very moment. Even if we don't know what the alternatives are, even if we only sort of start to scratch the surface, we really have to start looking for alternatives at this very moment. We can't just postpone it for the next 10, 20 years and then scratch our heads and start thinking about it. That's one thing. But another thing is that history has shown that extractivism and the rentier logic of a rentier state permeates the whole of society and transforms the political system, the national culture, and it creates a level of expectations that you can't just switch off after a few years. I mean, once this is settled in, it permeates the whole of society. You have rentier logic in the way the political system works. You tend to have a very centralized state apparatus, and you have corruption and clientelism and all sorts of things that it's really very hard to get rid of. I think that one of the reasons, one of the things that we have to take into consideration is that we have to recognize that the discourse and the ambition and the search for alternatives occurs in very complex societies where different sectors of society, not only the international corporations interested in extractivism, but people's expectations. In the case of Latin American countries, after this whole colonial past and the last 3-4 decades, whatever, of neoliberal policies, people were expecting that leftist or popular or whatever governments would respond to people's demands. And that's been the case. I mean, all the progressive governments have reduced inequality, have reduced unemployment, have increased social spending enormously, education, health, whatever. And people, I mean, in Brazil, something like 40 million people have come out of poverty as a consequence of the social programs carried out by Lula, etc. And this is basically based on extractivism. So you have a contradiction between the fact that there's a lot of widespread sort of local resistance to extractivism, but at the political level, people vote for extractivism. I mean, when people are given a platform in which you have a continuation of this type of social policies on one hand, and radical anti-extractivism proposals, people vote for the first. And that has been the case in Brazil. That's obviously the case in the last elections in Ecuador. And so it's not just a matter of discourse, and it's not just a matter of government will. It also has to do with the whole of society. I mean, a transformation of this sort is a transformation that requires a cultural transformation in people's expectations. It requires, a new notion of how to organize a local dependency, et cetera, and that's a long process, a difficult process, but at the same time it has to be faced at the very present.